Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tarrant.
And me, Chris Kitchener. In this podcast, we're hoping to explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and organisations tick. And as tradition, this week's podcast is brought to you, hang on, let me have a look at the bottle, apparently a rather interesting bottle of French Syrah. So, in recent episodes, Gareth, you talked about heuristics and bias, and I have to admit to you, in terms of the term biases, I know a small amount. I know that I am biased. But when you started talking about heuristics, that seemed particularly interesting, and I've not come across this sort of topic before, certainly from a business perspective. So let's talk about that today. But why don't we start, before I make a fool of myself and claim to know anything, why don't we start with sort of a 101? Gareth, what's a heuristic? Heuristic.
Yeah.
And heuristics and bias, what are they and why are they interesting?
So I think I've mentioned this before, but a heuristic is effectively a mental shortcut that you take when making sense of information. So we as humans have evolved to perceive the world based primarily on our primary sense of our eyes. So we view the world. But of course we have sensory perception in lots of other ways, not least hearing, smelling, sensing, temperature, touch, all of the senses. And there's a whole load of senses that we don't often think about. So we think about the 5 senses, but of course there's things like balance and your ability to sense where your hands are in relation to your eyes. Even when your eyes are closed, so there's actually a lot more complexity in sensing than perhaps we think about straight away. And as we've evolved to make sense of that world, we have created ways of shortcutting really complicated information to make sense of what we need to know in order to make really, really fast decisions. So if you go back to, and I am not in any way an anthropologist, but if you go back to the African savannah of 100,000 years ago, we quite often use the cliche of looking for that tiger in the jungle. But of course it is about finding food, it's about understanding the weather, it's about staying with the group, and all of these things. So we have created ways of interacting with the world without having to think about it. So it's probably worth me giving you an example. You will all be familiar with the fact that when you see a random collection of dots or a random pattern of things, we as humans, one of the primary things we see in that randomness is faces.
The first thing that occurs to me is that this is, first of all, incredibly valuable, and I guess another way of talking about heuristics, an example of a heuristic is a plan. I have written down if something happens, I've written down 5 steps for you. So I would imagine heuristics are incredibly valuable, but, and I'm always the one who looks at the downside of this, I don't know if that's a particularly English thing, but I would imagine that also heuristics can be incredibly dangerous.
Absolutely. So I've looked it up. It's called pareidolia, which is the tendency to see faces in random patterns. And of course we do that. We see the face of Jesus in a piece of toast.
I was just about to say, I have seen the face. So,
yeah, absolutely. And we do it. But it's and there's that famous case of one of the early images from Mars, overhead image of Martian rocks, and there's a face. And everybody, well, not everybody, of course, lots of people went, existence of civilized alien life. And of course it's not. It's the particular way the shadows fall on that particular day and our tendency to see faces and things. When you look at it, it's 2 dots and a line. It's not a face. But that's what we do. And we do it in really subtle ways as well. So heuristics are how we are able to park cars, for example. So we as humans are very, very good at taking information from the world around us and making sense of spatial awareness. We have two eyes to give us depth perception. And so when you're reverse parking a car, you are not stopping and thinking about, in real time, how far away is that curb in relation to that corner of the car. Your brain just does all that for you, but it's making all these mental shortcuts so that you're making assumptions about things without recognising it. And as you say, that can be incredibly dangerous. So for things that we are evolved to do really well, like communicate, we're pretty good at relying on our intuition. So when I'm looking at you now, I don't read your facial expressions consciously, but subconsciously I do. And I will change the pitch of my voice or whatever. Again, probably subconsciously, based on that information feedback. So that's a heuristic. What I haven't been evolved to do is to make sense of complex statistical data. So when I use my gut instinct to invest in the stock market, I'm probably going to succumb to the flaws of heuristics rather than the benefits of evolved skills. And that's why they're really closely related to bias, because the difference between a bias and a heuristic is heuristics are evolved shortcuts that your brain takes. Biases are learnt shortcuts that your brain takes. So we learn our biases from our environment.
We live in a world where everyone seems to have very, very strong views about whether something is a good or a bad thing. And I think the word bias typically implies a bad thing. A bias
has a negative reputation.
It has a negative reputation.
Yeah.
So, I have a bias, which means I am thinking in a way that is not useful to me, to be specific. But it feels to me like the term itself and the way we have bias, it perhaps in itself lacks emotion. In other words, it doesn't know that it's good or bad. There's good bias and there's bad bias.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Talk to me about some good bias.
So I don't think there is such a thing as good bias and bad bias.
Talk to me about some bias that has advantage.
It's context dependent.
Yeah.
So the reason that we are biased is the same reason that we have heuristics, because we as a species excel in operating in groups. So we are naturally inclined to group together and build trust relationships with people that look like us, with people that we interact with regularly. And so these things have advantage in terms of very, very quickly, as a toddler, learning your way in the world, making you scared of strangers and not scared of your parents, and then eventually your siblings. And so there's a definite advantage there, because otherwise you'd go wandering off at the supermarket. But of course, by the time you get to an adult, those biases still exist. And so we are predisposed to perhaps build trust relationships quicker with people that look like us. So things like all the protected characteristics, race, gender, the obvious physical characteristics, there is a bias that is natural. It's not natural, because I've said it's from your environment, but it's learned from a young age. So, and there are definite negative connotations to that, of course. And so being aware of that is really, really important. But there's also biases that we have by the fact that we're just exposed to certain types of information. And again, this can often be quite useful, because it means when there's huge amounts of information, we tend to build biases to trusted sources.
I think this is...
But again, can be really dangerous.
But I think this is a really important point, because I think, particularly this term bias, as I say, it has a generally negative term. And if there's something that these discussions continue to reiterate is there's no simple algorithm to give you the best outcome. And so in the same way, there are biases which are advantageous and there are biases which are either not advantageous. And what I mean by that is they don't lead to the best outcome. I guess the trick is, well, there's a couple of questions. How do you know whether something is a useful bias? and therefore you either accept or even accentuate it. And how do you know that something is a bad bias? Whatever that, or not, sorry, again, you've got to stop me when I say the word good or bad, not advantageous. So I'll give you an example of what I think is a bias that is not advantageous. And I would imagine as time goes on, you're going to hear me rail against this, which is one of the things which I hereby declare is not allowed on this podcast or any discussions are terms like woke or snowflake or any of those terms, because I don't think they are. I don't like them, but I don't even think they're useful.
They're oversimplifications.
They're oversimplifications. Yeah. But so let's put all of that to one side. And anyone who has just been inflamed by me saying woke is a bad word, thank you. You've self-selected whether we think we're interesting. I think diversity is a hugely advantageous attribute.
Yes.
So in business, there are people making very large sums of money creating some marvellous diversity training, which are great. And frankly, I think actually sometimes don't even help. From a different perspective, I have worked with teams where they looked and sounded like me, and they were good teams. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And I've worked with teams where they look very different to me, and they have different backgrounds, different contexts. Here's a perfect example. I have worked with offshore engineering teams from India, and these were fantastic, and they brought different concepts, they brought different ideals, they brought different history. And actually I've worked in more diverse teams. So for me, as an example, diversity, not because somehow I want to follow some, written down view of how the world should be, and coming back to I like this as a phrase, the most effective I can be is often or almost always when I have a diverse team to bring me the best, most different ideas that we can pick from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we started talking about bias, and you brought in diversity very quickly. And of course, the reason that diversity is so valuable in a team is that it is the mitigation for bias. Because we are all biased, but we're all biased in very different ways and to varying degrees. And so by having a diverse team, you end up with the wisdom of the crowd, because the biases get cancelled out.
Yeah.
Not only that, but you also then have a wider pool of experience from which ideas can be generated and created. I'm going to be slightly controversial here. There are situations where diversity actually creates inefficiencies. And so, objectively, actually, you want conformity, and therefore diversity can become a problem.
I think it's this point about, going back to the very carefully phrased, there are biases that are advantageous and there are biases that are not.
It's context dependent, and if you think about the Frederick Winslow Taylor, kind of the godfather of scientific management, this was a guy who was driven by this idea of making business more efficient, and wrote a book called The Science of Management. And he effectively came up with this concept of uniformity in production. And he writes some really quite, you look at it now, it's quite repulsive almost, because he describes people as commodities. And he talks about the fact that, if you've got a production line, you want everybody to be the same height and have the same reach. Because then you can have all your positions and stations on that production line the same distance. Yeah. You can time that, and he was very precise. It was all about, he would go round workshops with a stopwatch, and it was all about precision and accuracy and speed. And if you've got something you're trying to achieve that is very fixed, you know what the solution is, efficiency is really, really important to get that competitive advantage. And that's why production lines are standardised as much as possible, and therefore you don't want diversity. Now, diversity just means different. I'm not talking about these loaded concepts. What I'm simply talking about is uniformity versus diversity in the definition of different versus the same.
I agree, but I think as with all these things, the sort of onion pieces to pull back, which is, I am in the military. Here you go. Not, just to be again clear. And therefore, the military's goal is to come up with a common way to defeat the enemy in a way in which I want them all to behave in a common way so that then I can, as it were, control an organisation to do this. So therefore, you would say, well, this is a game of efficiency. I just want them to be efficient. There's a book. And all of a sudden you read it, and I believe that's how
we wear uniforms.
The Warsaw Pact had fabulous doctrine, which said this is what you do.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that's a really interesting one. Where, by the way, I think that's a very valid statement that says we've got 100,000 people. We want them to communicate in the same way, train in the same way, and yet I would imagine inherently in that of uniformity, there is a challenge that says, I don't want them to be all uniform because now I know how to defeat that. I actually want to have improvisation. I want to have enough difference. And you know,
absolutely, yeah. And you've jumped the gun on where I was going, because I was being controversial to say, you know, diversity is not always good, but that's in a world where what you're trying to achieve is fixed. You know that. I'm trying to produce, I don't know, the Ford Model T. You know, I want every single one to be the same. It's never going to change. It's about efficiency. That isn't the real world. So production lines, which are now mostly done by machines with people supporting.
The same reach, same height.
I want my machines to be the same.
Yeah.
Whereas people, we've proven time and time again, you know, we operate in complex environments, and this diversity thing is really, really valuable. And the military is a really, really good example of this, because as you've alluded to, we've created structures that are the same. We've created uniforms. Rank structures are very, very discrete. They're very clear. They don't change. There's no ambiguity. We have uniforms. We do drill, which is marching around parade squares, you know, where everybody marches in step, and these all come from a way of fighting conflicts, a way of fighting wars, where managing large bodies of people was really difficult, and communication was done by, you know, writing your notes and then sending dispatch riders on horseback around the battlefield. So actually that efficiency was quite useful in managing large bodies of people, because you could change what you were doing faster than the adversary if they didn't have that uniformity. So paradoxically, by starting from a uniform base, you had more flexibility to change. At the individual level, at the soldier, they didn't. They had drills and they did what they were told. As communication has got faster, we've found that flexibility needs to be driven right the way down. So now we're at a stage, and we talked about this on a previous podcast episode, where we talked about mission command and the idea of telling people what to achieve but not how to do it. Well, that's because, like you said, you can predict how people are going to behave if their drills are written down. The adversary is changing the circumstance, and also, you know, random factors like the weather change or whatever it is. As the circumstances change, if you've got a very hierarchical system, you don't have that agility. And so this is where this combination of delegated authority and diverse thinking gives you an unpredictability, which gives you an advantage.
But it seems like it's this really interesting push and pull where uniformity in an organisation is highly valuable, because that's how you get an increasingly large number of people to go in the same direction. But you also want this, and I'll use the term diversity, even though it's different. You want this diversity in approach, because that allows you to break free from the limits of uniformity. And I know we're both fans of military history, and in the Second World War, the Germans were known. They became famous for the fact that if they were attacked, the first thing the Germans would do is counterattack. And this was hugely successful, because literally, even if they didn't have the troops, they would turn around, and the first moment they could counterattack was what they would do, because the soldiers or the units that originally assaulted them had reached a point of almost exhaustion, and then the counterattack would push them back. This became
culmination.
Exactly, on a tactical sort of battle level, but it was well known. In the latter parts of the Second World War, as the Allied forces started to understand what the German doctrine was, they not only understood that the Germans would counterattack, this was a primary part of their battle plan, because their battle plan was attack, lose as few people as possible. In other words, not a serious attack,
a feint almost,
and then stop and make sure the artillery was pointing exactly where the Germans would counterattack.
Yeah.
And as the latter part of the war went on, because we understood their system, we used it to our advantage. And so that's a really interesting case of, the counterattack doctrine worked incredibly well for a long time.
Yeah.
Right up until the point where the doctrine failed. So going back to that point about sort of balancing predictability and order and planning and heuristics with unpredictability and just throwing a sprinkling of bias on there. Here's my question for you. How do you know which to do at which time? Because there's one time when you say, go do the thing that's written in the book and you will all be great. And there's another point which you say, please throw the book away because that's no longer...
My dog is desperate to get out of the room. So that is a fascinating question, and I think this comes back to the concept of agility, flexibility and agility. And the value you get from having uniformity is you get a shared sense of what other people are going to do. And you also have at an individual level, a sense of what is required in certain types of situations. What you don't want is that to be the dogma or the orthodoxy that you're not allowed to do something different. What you want is that to be the baseline from which you then deviate as the situation requires. So what that allows you to do is to respond to changing external dynamics. In conflict, it's going to be what the enemy's doing or how the weather's changing or opportunities that arise. In business, it will be exactly the same. It will be what are the competitors doing. It will be the conversation you're having at the time with the client and their response. What you want is freedom of action to be able to apply your imaginative thought to respond. So you want a common baseline. And I think the best example of this is the reason we do fire drills. We do fire drills in an office building or wherever you are, and we walk through, so the alarm goes off and everybody is told to leave the building, leave your laptop, don't gather your coat, do all that. You walk calmly to the exit, you make your way out into the car park, and then somebody takes a register to make sure you're all there. And we all know that isn't how fires work. But that doesn't make the fire drill pointless. What it means is when there is a fire or some sort of emergency, you have a common baseline of what you're supposed to do, and then when you're faced with the realities of that dynamic situation, you can amend that plan. You know where the exits are. That exit's now blocked. You can now do something different. So you are responsive, but from a common starting point.
But I'm going to push you on this because I think you haven't quite answered my question yet, which is, how do you know when to stick with the orthodoxy versus to break it? And we've all been there. I know I've said this multiple times, and I will continue to say it, which is, I love the fact that we take successful people and we say, all we have to do is describe how they behave, and you will you will have described them successfully.
Yeah.
So we will go and say, again, to keep the sort of the Second World War motif going, is Erwin Rommel was unpredictable. He didn't follow the orthodoxy. He made his own rules, and he was brilliantly successful. Fantastic. So if I do that, I'll be successful. Well, actually, I can point to a number of military leaders who did that and were appalling and failed miserably. So I'll come back to the question. How do you know when to follow the manual, and how do you know when to, for want of a better word, don't mean this literally, throw the manual away and do something different? When do you walk to the fire exit and go to the car park versus when do you say, that's a bad idea, I'm going to go out the window?
So I think the answer is easy, the implementation of it is difficult. So I'd say when the situation is not working, or when the response is not working. So when you go to the fire exit and it's on fire or blocked, or for whatever reason that is not a viable exit, you're not going to push on because that's the way we were told to do it. Now, that's a very physical and visceral reality.
No, but I like that.
But effectively, you need feedback to say what we're doing isn't working.
So I think this touches very much on my world, and there's a concept I want to sort of run by you in a second. But in my world, I work in, they describe this as this world, agile development.
Yeah.
Which, frankly, is a word that's designed to make lots of people lots of money to talk endlessly about it. But fundamentally, it talks about a loop, and we're not going to talk about OODA loops this week, but we will talk about OODA loops. It is this idea of inspect and adapt.
Yes, yeah, a feedback loop.
A feedback loop, and if done on a regular basis, it allows you not to say, "Oh, I'm Kodak. I've run out of business. I kept doing the thing I did. I was massively successful for how many years, and now nobody wants to buy film anymore. I'm dead." So I think the inspection and adaptation is what you just talked about. Oh look, that door feels hot. Let's not go through that door. I walk to the I don't know, the window. We're up high. Let's not do that. And you carry on. I want to bring this. I want to sort of change the spin a little bit into sort of more practical, because I think, and I actually touched on this with the concept of Kodak, which is sort of a story that's told in the industry about a company that in effect followed, in the language you've used, followed doctrine or followed dogma, and then one day they were out. I think businesses are average at making plans. I'll probably get in trouble. People say my business is brilliant at making plans, but we spend lots of time saying, technical support, when a customer phones, you pick up the phone, you go through the script, you do those things. So when we have expected paths, businesses are generally okay to good. I think the bit, and it goes back to this heuristics and bias, which is where we started, is I wonder whether where business is bad, not good word, whether business isn't as successful as perhaps the military, is that when we are forced to react or adapt in a situation we haven't been in before. So the last 10 years, the competition has been static. We understood everything about them. And on Monday morning, we walk in and all of a sudden we're starting to lose business against a company we've never heard of, that's not even selling a product that we recognise.
Yeah.
I think that's the bit that's interesting, which is how do you adapt to that? And again, it's this idea of heuristics say this is how we behave. Bias says, well, my way is still going to work, they're not going to work. So what's your sense on that? And maybe there was a more interesting, I don't know whether I can't remember whether we've talked about this before, which is, I think business isn't very good at reacting. I think the military, by its definition, because the enemy aren't on the hill you predicted 5 years ago. What's your take on that?
There are definitely examples of military failures as a result of them failing to respond or react. I take the point, and I think there is definitely more of it's expected that you're going to come up against quite radical, volatile change and have to respond. I think the Kodak example is, I'm not an expert on it at all, but it is rolled out as one of those examples of systematic failure. And I think at its core, it was driven by bias, because what had always worked was the orthodoxy. And the reality is that the environment had changed and they were trying to be efficient, but they were efficiently wrong. And that comes back to understanding where your biases are and the flaws that creates in your decision making. And when we talk about feedback, there's two things we have to do. Firstly, we have to have diversity of thought in the way that we think about problem sets. And then we also have to have diversity in understanding the information that's coming back in that feedback. Because otherwise, our biases and our heuristics will allow us to pick and choose the information that fits our narrative, and we will be driven down this line of, yeah, I know that's bad news, but that's not our fault because, and there is, there are these traits of human nature. It's a heuristic, and it's a protective heuristic that we've developed, that when things go well, we congratulate ourselves for really good decision making. When things go badly, we blame it on bad luck or somebody else's mistake. And so if you don't have a team that firstly can think about problems in different ways, so has that diversity, and secondly can't question the orthodoxy of the senior person in the room to say, well, actually, perhaps this is our fault, perhaps we could have done things better, perhaps feedback falls on deaf ears and becomes an irrelevance.
I mean, I want to throw out another concept, because I think, and I want you to apply the ideas of heuristics and bias to this, which is disruption. And the value and necessity of disruption. So we'll come back to that in a second, but I'm
creative disruption.
Well, I was going to say, because I again,
Hayek,
to keep coming back to I get nervous about reading books. Like you, I've got to stop saying I'm nervous about reading books, because I do love reading books, but these kinds of books, the Kodak one seems to be simple. And I'm not an expert, and I'm sure there are many people that have written books on this entire thing, but the statement that Kodak, in fact, people have said Kodak needed to disrupt themselves. And so actually Kodak are shown as an example of that sometimes businesses need to disrupt themselves. Well, first of all, there's that's against the heuristics. There's a bias there. And actually for the Kodak one, I would offer up another alternative. Kodak did exactly the right thing. There was a business, they maximized that business, and if they had disrupted themselves successfully, it was a 50-50 chance they were going to do well. In fact, I would argue they did try to disrupt themselves and they failed. So in fact, in that case, should they have said, forget the disruption, we are literally going to make as much money from this thing called film until one day we will die, and that will be fine. Anyway, to go back...
I'm not sure the CEO and the board of directors, as part of their strategy, just said there is an end point to this. And,
no, but
there is a lack of adaptability.
I actually think that's a bias, which is we must always come up with the next bright idea. In that case... that they were risking the viability of the Kodak business in their attempts to disrupt it. And I'm sure there are people shouting at their device who listen to this saying, but it's disrupt or die. And in this case, they failed to disrupt and they died. But I would argue,
I think the term disruption, the term disruption is loaded. It's adapt or die, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's
to the market,
and I'd like better.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to recognising the organic nature of an organisation. So we think of our organisations as machines, and this comes back to that Frederick Winslow Taylor kind of idea of efficient machines, a well-oiled machine, and the military doing drill, We use these analogies, we use military efficiency or well-oiled machines, and actually we need to start adapting and thinking about our organisations as organic systems that evolve, develop and grow. But the only way you can do that is if you delegate and push decision-making out from the boardroom.
Yeah.
You have feedback loops, as we've talked about, and you have diversity, because what you want to do is mitigate out the crazy. So when people, come up with a crazy idea, there's enough people around to say, what are the problems with that? Will it work? Won't it work? Rather than just, we're not doing it because it's crazy, or we are doing it because it's crazy. And, innovation is not about doing the radical change. Innovation is about implementation of new ideas. If the idea is utter bollocks, you're going to lose a lot of money. So having these adaptive organisations that can learn, develop and grow, rather than a monolithic structure that has to pivot at a point where it suddenly recognises the market has changed, because it's too late, and we know you can't change a culture overnight. We've talked about that. So I think this diversity thing and understanding biases links very, very neatly into the idea of psychological safety, delegation of decision making, and adaptability amongst a complex operating environment.
I'm having one of these familiar moments as we have these conversations where just when I think I've vaguely got my head around how I need to work and how I need to behave and how others might be successful, all of a sudden the gaping chasm of the rest of humanity and the world is revealed to me. It's like I've just had a vision of space and it's big and complicated. I've said this a couple of times, which is, and maybe this ties into the heuristics idea, which is we love to think that it's if A is true, then B will be true, and then C will be true. And the reality is it's the flapping butterfly in Venezuela.
Absolutely.
That means that whether it rains outside or it doesn't rain outside, and it goes down to it's sort of an individual that has a bad day, which ripples through and says, we didn't make the decision to disrupt. It's the crazy person who came up with the wrong kind of crazy. I'm maybe this was one of the sort of the driving tenets for this, which is, it turns out if you think this stuff is easy, probably not paying attention, which is, we can't be brilliant at everything, but we really have to sort of think carefully about all of these things. There's a statement that I've often heard, and again, I think one of the values of this podcast is that I'm going to build a real tribe of people who really don't like me, even though they're but one of the things that I've begun to laugh at is, and I get this very much in the product world, is people who introduce themselves as serial entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
I don't know that you've got that in the military. In fact, I wonder if the military would be a brilliant example. So serial entrepreneurs, I literally had this where I was at a meetup with some other product leaders, and they said, hi, my name is Bob, and I've failed with 3 businesses. And it was really interesting where this idea of silly entrepreneur, if I can do it, in fact, in this case, if I can fail once, I can fail many times. But I've had this elsewhere where I've worked in a business where the owner made £10 million, they sold the business. And so there is an immediate assumption they must be a great leader. And therefore, let's give them some money and they'll go do it again. Google was brilliant at this product, and so they're going to be brilliant at all these other products. Not true.
Well, I mean, we have a current petri dish with Twitter, don't we, where we've, the jury is out on, is Elon Musk a brilliant innovator who has seen something that the rest of us have missed, or was he very, very good in a particular field and is now potentially bitten off more than we can chew? We will see. Well,
let's actually, you know what? We're allowed to idly chat these things. We're the ones. What do you think about Elon Musk? Now, I think we should be very clear here. Neither of us have ever met the guy. Nope. We don't know about him, so we have just as much data as everyone else. Also, I presume you're not a shareholder of Twitter.
I'm not, no.
So, given all of that, which means that we have absolutely either no right and no useful knowledge, what do you think of him as a leader?
That's a fascinating question. So, I watched a Netflix documentary on SpaceX, and he came across in that, and I have no idea how much influence he had in the editing of it or whatever, but he came across as very passionate about not only the exploration of space and the success of the company, but also about the people involved. And I came away with a really positive view of this, quite radical but quite brilliant leader. And he showed empathy, he showed compassion, interest, deep specialist knowledge. He balanced direction with taking advice, and I was really quite impressed. Conversely to that, of course, we've also seen everything else that's going on in the media and the Twitter storm and all of that. And there is no doubt he has done some really positive things in the disruption of some really large sectors that needed disrupting. But at an individual level, he has also showed, I think, some quite narcissistic tendencies that allude to the fact that he thinks that he's good, not because he's surrounded himself with the right people and built the right cultures, but just on an individual level, he can make decisions better than others, and I think that's a really dangerous thing.
Well, I mean, this was meant to be sort of a fun little 5-minute sojourn in it, and I'll tell you what I think. But to phrase it a different way, he has demonstrated a bias that he believes he is the magic factor in these things, and so
yeah.
I think there is an example of, is there a regular inspection and adaptation? Does he have someone to tap him on the shoulder and say, you're sounding a bit crazy, Elon? The idea that you're sleeping on the floor of the Twitter offices, that demonstrates passion, mission, some great things. To everyone else says, I don't think you need to do that to build an amazing business.
Yeah,
you're just a bit crazy. You fired a bunch of people and all these kinds of things. So I think even when we sort of branch off and talk about these different areas, I think these concepts that we talk about in this case, heuristics, bias, and diversity, I think is really important. I tend to agree with you, by the way. I think had admiration. I think what SpaceX has done is an example of, everyone said it couldn't be done, and it was done. I think likewise, everyone said that, in terms of Tesla and cars, that would never be a success, and he demonstrated that. I think he risks being in that category of leader of Steve Jobs, perhaps more so, which is, the history books will say he was a genius unless he sort of implodes, because he did these amazing things, and I agree he did, but that doesn't necessarily make him a good leader. And here's the question I always ask, and I've seen this so many times with people who are declared to me to be great or brilliant, and that is, I'm not going to discuss whether they are great or brilliant. I'm going to say, could someone else have actually done it even better? In other words, could you have been Tesla without actually going nearly bust? Yeah. Could you have acquired Twitter without, frankly, being a bit of an arse and firing a bunch of people and vocally saying, I don't care, and saying, well, I think in the UK, allegedly, he just sent an email to people saying, get out of the office, which of course you can't do. So I think he is Schrodinger's good leader, and that he has elements of leadership which are very impressive. The personal,
he's both good and bad at the same time.
And I actually suspect that is true of all leaders.
Yeah.
The bit that is interesting is there introspection, and is there a sense of this inspecting and adapting? And a concept we haven't really talked about today is, who helps the leaders say, okay, that's a crazy idea.
Yeah.
Versus, I've always wondered. This is my final sort of idle thought, maybe for this podcast, which is, I have a secret fantasy that I am going to one day go into politics, which of course I will never do, and I feel really terrible. But here's a concept I wondered, which would be really interesting, which is, it seems to me, again, I've not done this, so I could be completely wrong. Often we will use our bias to say, go away and come up with a brilliant plan to do X, whatever X might be. And we have plenty of examples of X these days. My sort of fantasy is I would do this, and for every time I said to someone, go and make me a plan for X, I would send someone else, unrelated to golf, and tell me why a plan for X was a terrible idea. Because what I really want is, I want someone who's passionate that it's a bad idea to tell me why it's a bad idea, along with the person who's passionate that it's a good idea, and then leave me to say, okay, to help break my bias, I want both arguments side by side. And it's not because I need balance and I need fairness. Forget fairness and balance. But when you place these two things together, often you'll go, well, this thing that I thought was good is clearly a terrible idea because now I look at the information against.
Yeah.
I really shouldn't do that.
So we've talked about military leaders and how they can be quite susceptible to this because of the ranks, because of the structures. They can become quite susceptible to groupthink because it's very difficult to stand up to a senior military leader. So in military planning, we've developed a method of doing exactly that. So you will be familiar with the term a red cell, but it is exactly that. It is the idea of taking a plan, taking a concept, and then picking holes in it, and literally being cynical about every aspect of it. And some of that will be valid and some of it won't, but the discussion that it generates means that you're not, what you're not doing is saying, oh, excuse me, Colonel, I think your plan is rubbish. What you're doing is saying, you've asked me to look at this, here are where I think all these flaws are, or what if this happens. The next stage is to war game, where somebody actually acts as the enemy and tries to win against that plan. I think we need to explore that.
I think that's a whole topic because I
Absolutely.
think I would, my final thought for the day is, I don't think business does that at all. And if someone's out there going, oh, we do it all the time. In my experience, and I've now been doing this for more than 20 years, I don't think we do that. I think people lay lip service to that. And actually, there is a bias that says, if I challenge that idea, it's a negative thing, rather than challenging that idea, either will reveal its flaws or more likely make the plan better.
Yeah,
I think there's an assumption that
definitely.
Once I've made a plan, you better just follow it.
So I run workshops where I teach people how to wargame plans, how to red team plans, and I agree with you. I think that there's not enough of it going on. That's a subject for another podcast. I think before we end, we want to get back to heuristics and biases. I'm going to ask you a quick question. Are you afraid of sharks?
Am I afraid of sharks?
Yes.
I am. Am I allowed to say yes and no? I am afraid of sharks, as in if I was swimming and a shark was coming after me, I'd be afraid.
I think that's a sensible answer.
But generically, I believe more people are killed by Coke machines than sharks. So in that respect, I'm more afraid of a Coke machine than a shark.
Okay, again, you've got to preempt where I'm going with this, because my next question was going to be, are you afraid of swimming? And then the reality is, you are 45,000 times more likely to die of drowning because of an injury jumping into a swimming pool, or a medical condition, or just poor swimming technique, than you are to be killed by a shark. And yet I know far more people that won't go swimming in the sea because of sharks, wherever they are in the world, but they're happy to take their kids to the swimming pool. And I think that just shows...
It's a fabulous bias.
It's a bias, and it's a heuristic, because it's driven by our innate human nature to avoid predators, but also it's a bias that we've learned from our environment, because we make lots of films and we talk about shark attacks and it sells newspapers when it happens, whereas somebody drowning in a pool is not very newsworthy and it's a boring film. So it's a combination of biases and heuristics. And on that note, I think we should conclude. Thank you for joining us once again. If you've liked what you've heard, please do tell your friends, subscribe, get them to subscribe. We'd also love your interaction as well. So if you want to join the conversation, please send us your stories, your ideas or suggestions for future topics. And you can follow us, suggest these things, get in touch via our Twitter, which is at Battling with Biz with a Z. But for now though, that's it, so goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.